What's up, guys? My name is Jake, and welcome to Abandoned, episode 45. This is the show where we talk about some of the most interesting abandoned places in the world. If you've watched all the episodes I have of Abandoned, you may recall that I did an episode on the abandoned Legendary Years Resort in Walt Disney World. Since that was one of the earlier episodes, today I'm going to redo that video and talk about the sort of bizarre situation going on with a Disney hotel that was literally left abandoned right in plain view of Disney's Pop Century Resort. Actually, this was the never finished and eventually abandoned phase 2 of that very resort. So let's take a look at why there is currently only half a century represented at the resort, and why the Legendary Years portion was ultimately abandoned. It all started in the early 1990s, when the Walt Disney Company was making massive investments in their Florida resort. Around this time, Walt Disney World only had moderate to deluxe hotels, with no real option for economy lodging on site. And with management's mentality that keeping guests on property equals higher profits, they needed to extend out to this potentially lucrative market. So in 1994, Disney opened the first of its eventually 3 sister hotels with Disney's All-Star Sports Resort. It was comprised of over 1,900 rooms, all priced much cheaper than any other Disney hotel that they had been offering. Today, these resorts, I would say, are a little tacky and very 90s, but at the time, and I guess even now, the benefits of a Disney resort, coupled with the extremely modest prices per night, proved to be exceedingly successful. Even after a combined total of over 5,000 rooms between all 3 All-Star resorts, Disney was still planning to expand, and this time, very aggressively. In December of 1999, Disney officially announced their plans for an enormous brand new value resort placed just below the Caribbean Beach Hotel. This new resort would focus around pop culture through the decades of the 20th century, celebrating key moments in each and presenting them in dramatic, oversized props. The now named Disney's Pop Century Resort would be split into 2 halves, the first being the Legendary Years, comprised of 10 4-story buildings celebrating the decades from the early 1900s to the 1940s. Mirrored on the other side of a body of water called Hourglass Lake would be the Classic Years. Laid out in an identical style to the Legendary Years, this side of the resort would showcase the 1950s to the late 1990s, and connecting the 2 sides of the resort would be the Generation Gap Bridge. Altogether, these 2 massive halves of one resort would hold over 5,760 rooms, more than doubling the already existing value rooms on property. Each side would have its own dedicated check-in building, complete with a food court and an arcade. And soon, construction began in February of 2000, with the master plan being built in phases. The Classic Years portion of Pop Century would begin first with an expected opening date of winter 2001, and the second phase, that being the Legendary Years, opening in 2002. By June of 2001, construction was very far along with the Classic Years portion of Pop Century. Most of the buildings were already vertical, and some even finished with paint and exterior theming put in place. Site prep, foundations, and even some vertical construction also began on the Legendary Years portion. Reservations were then opened up to the public for the Classic Years grand opening in December of 2001. However, Disney decided to push the opening date until 2002, citing they wanted to complete more of the lodging structures before opening.
Our newest value resort is Disney's Pop Century Resort, featuring bigger than you can imagine symbols of some of the 20th century's most popular icons. It opens March 2002.
As the resort's construction continued closer to completion, the attacks in New York City on September 11th brought the whole country to a standstill. The rippling effects of the disaster caused tourism numbers in America to fall dramatically. Walt Disney World was devastated by the sudden drop in attendance, and with their huge operating costs, it was only a matter of time before things were cut. Disney began closing rides across the resort, cutting some transportation methods, and even temporarily shutting down entire hotels like French Quarter. Over at Pop Century, things were not looking good. Immediately after September 11th, construction was halted at both the Classic and Legendary Years, as Disney now had a multi-million-dollar 5,000-room hotel almost finished construction. Presumably with people already canceling their reservations there, Disney had postponed construction on the resort until further notice. For over 2 years after construction was abruptly stopped, both sides of Disney's Pop Century Resort were left abandoned, with the Classic Years looking like it was almost finished. Finally, Disney resumed construction on the almost finished resort and opened the Pop Century Resort on December 14th, 2003. The only problem was, the Legendary Years side was still abandoned, right across the lake from the now open resort. Another 2,800 rooms likely couldn't be filled at the time, and finishing the relatively early stages of construction would have been a poor investment to make. However, guests began to wonder why their Lakeview hotel room now looked over an abandoned hotel. So now the eerie, unfinished ghost structures sat desolate in an overgrown field. Theming elements were left outside the lobby structure, and the outlines of where the original hotel buildings were going to go were slowly broken through by nature. While the Generation Gap Bridge was built, when you crossed over to the other side, you would be met by a wooden work wall and eventually by overgrown foliage. So the vacant tower sat dormant with no real future announced, and the tourism crash gave Disney no motivation to finish what they had started. In 2005, Disney began to toy around with the idea of introducing new family suites in their value resorts. They began doing this as a test in their all-star resorts, and that proved to be a potentially lucrative and popular offering at their value hotels. Sites around the area as well had seen very positive results with introducing family suites at their hotels, as they offered more room at a more economical price. So as the tourism market recovered, and as Disney looked to do something with their abandoned structures at Pop Century, in May of 2010, the company finally announced their intentions for their former Phase 2 site. Disney's Art of Animation Resort would now take the place of the former Legendary Years Hotel, now theming the resort to Disney animation properties with 4 main sections: Cars, Finding Nemo, The Lion King, and The Little Mermaid. Most of the new resort would feature brand new suite-only buildings with interior corridors, adding 1,120 family rooms corresponding to their own section of theming. Interestingly, the new resort was going to keep what Disney had already built. Despite the structures being abandoned for over a decade, they had always been taken care of and now were still salvageable. So the northern portion of the resort would have 864 standard guest rooms, utilizing the 2 already built towers. The new hotel would also keep the exact same layouts as the original. So finally, after 12 years since the Legendary Years portion at Pop Century was first announced, the Art of Animation Resort finally opened to the public, with, interestingly, the last phase of the resort being the original already built towers, finally opening in September of 2012. Now Disney's Pop Century Resort stands today as a hotel showcasing, well, half a century. The intended vision behind the resort was well executed, and really it was only caught at the absolute worst time. Literally one of the most devastating tourism crashes in history. Disney was building a resort that would double the value room capacity from 3 existing all-star resorts. And when all of this happened, room occupancy shot down, and Disney was left with a brand new resort that they couldn't fill. Today, there isn't much evidence of the never-finished resort. Obviously, the shells of the former Legendary Years lodging buildings, as well as the lobby structure, were changed into the new hotel, and probably most people staying there would have no idea. Really, some of the only evidence can be seen from the air. The 2 existing buildings clearly have a different roof than the newly built structure. Also, over at Pop Century, the lobby is still named the Classic Hall, originally meant to distinguish the lobby buildings from each other. Honestly, I don't really think the Legendary Years was anything special, and Art of Animation, despite it being based lazily around Disney characters and having hideous suites, the hotel does continue with the bold and bright buildings with oversized characters. However, I'd say in a more timeless and modern way. Personally, I don't like that sort of thing, but I'm sure kids and families really enjoy it. I think at the end of the day, this whole situation really showed how bad things had gotten in Walt Disney World. It's pretty telling that it got to the point where Disney's best possible conclusion was to postpone the opening of a nearly finished resort for 2 years, and to completely abandon the other half of the resort entirely, for over a decade in itself. The whole bizarre situation left a never-finished master plan for a popular resort and a Disney hotel completely abandoned. I hope you enjoyed this video, everyone. I was going through my older videos and I rewatched the Legendary Years video, and because it's such a crazy and interesting topic, and because my video on it is not very good, I figured I should redo it. If you enjoy this video, please share it with people who also might find it interesting, as it's a pretty crazy topic, and if you're ever at Pop Century or Art of Animation, it'll be an interesting thing to think about. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat, and thank you very much for watching.
Yes.